Hi there, welcome to the latest YouTube clip. We're looking at the impact of alcohol on an unborn baby and how that can then develop into something called Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder, or FASD. And the aim of this little clip is to try and explain what it is and what this might look like in school. So, getting a diagnosis of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder can be quite tricky, and there are lots of children who never have the diagnosis but have been exposed to levels of alcohol. However, what we do know is that there are different definitions depending on what medics see. So there's the full fetal alcohol syndrome, there's a partial fetal alcohol syndrome, and something called alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder. And the first two of those are medical diagnoses and need to be made by specially trained paediatricians. There are very few of these in the country that I'm aware of, so obviously getting a diagnosis can be quite difficult. However, we do know that the diagnosis is based on 4 factors, and that is that you have to be acknowledged that mum was drinking whilst pregnant, so exposure needs to be confirmed, that there are distinctive facial features, and we'll go on to see what they might be a bit later on. Growth may have needed to have been a problem, or not needed to have been a problem, but maybe a problem, so low birth weight or slow growth, and also damage to the central nervous system. And I've just got a bit of a YouTube clip beneath that, and if you click on that, that will take you to a video that was recorded before 2018 when the new government guidelines came in, and it's a conversation with a medic about what impact alcohol will have on an unborn baby. What we're led to understand is that only about 40% of babies born to mums who drink have a diagnosis of FAS. And mainly that's because they don't have those facial characteristics that we're going to look at in a while. The face forms very early on in the pregnancy, and quite often mums whose drinking escalates throughout the pregnancy aren't drinking terribly heavily at that moment when the face is formed. So it's only then when those children get to school that perhaps we question that a bit more, because they struggle with certain behaviours like focusing, remembering, understanding the time, and it may also be that when subsequent children are born to that mum that they do have those features because mum's drinking has become far more tricky for her to manage. So then we perhaps consider that alcohol could have been part of that mum's pregnancy story. It's also important to remember that perhaps mums who drink may also take drugs or may smoke, and also that they'll be very stressed, unlikely to be taking care of themselves, and perhaps attending medical appointments. So that unborn child is being exposed to lots and lots of different things, not just alcohol. It's important to remember that any damage that is done to the brain whilst in utero is permanent, so cells are actually killed off, they're not going to regrow. And there's a little diagram here where you can see that the brain of a child whose brain has been affected by alcohol is smaller, particularly in the frontal cortex, and that therefore is the damage that the alcohol has done to the brain. Turn away now if you don't like operations or things like that. But this then can demonstrate or show you that damage happens in various areas of brain. So depending on where that child is at that point of development, when the large amounts of alcohol are ingested by birth mum, different parts of the brain will be affected. And obviously they will always be vulnerable to damage from the alcohol that it's exposed to. And this table here and this little diagram demonstrates hopefully what we were talking about earlier about how a child's face can become affected by the impact of alcohol whilst in utero. So the child may have a smaller head and a flat bridge of the nose, the eyes might seem smaller, or the openings of the eyes might seem smaller, and a fold of skin might appear underneath the eye at the point where the two eyelids meet. Ears may be low set, and quite often the child will have a thin upper lip. So when we're thinking about the impact of the alcohol on the brain and what might be associated with FAS, there are lots and lots of different things that could be impacted. As we said earlier, it just depends on when the large amounts of alcohol were drunk and the stage of development that baby was at. So often there can be developmental delay. Quite often this doesn't become pronounced until a child starts school, so they might just scrape through the developmental milestones whilst they're in their early years, but actually when it comes to sitting down and concentrating, this tends to be when a lot of the issues or the things that child's finding difficult are recognised and noticed by people. So they struggle to sit still in lessons. They may sort of present as being a bit ADHD, a bit all over the place, or struggle to focus for any length of time on what people are saying. They also may become hyper aroused if there's lots of loud noises, perhaps on the playground, for example. They may have learning difficulties, particularly so in maths for some reason. So telling the time can be really difficult, counting can be difficult, remembering times tables may also be a struggle for these children. Although conversely, I have worked with children who are a bit of a whiz with the old maths, so although it can be a problem, it's not a problem for all children. There may be speech and language delays, and this is more noticeable in complex speech or understanding of words and being able to process them. And quite often these children will have developed strategies to hide what it is that they're not managing to understand. Quite often they sound very adult in what they're saying, but we know then that actually isn't being processed and they don't actually understand what's being said to them, they just know to repeat it. I worked with a girl who has brilliantly got loads of skills to cover up what she was struggling with, and it was only when she sat her mocks at GCSE level that this young woman who was predicted A's and B's was actually not going to pass any of her GCSEs because she'd got so many strategies up her sleeve for copying, for noticing, for sitting next to people, that it was only then when we realised that her functionality was probably a lot weaker than we thought it was. There can often be specific problems with understanding people, social behaviours. Quite often they'll take things literally. They will struggle with friendship groups. Some may not. There might be motor problems, so they might struggle with the fine motor skills. Also things around spatial awareness and visual problems, so they might invade people's personal space a bit more. And I guess the important thing is to remember that all these children don't have these behaviours. These behaviours are different for different children. Their environments will give them different coping strategies. So every child is going to be unique. Quite often the child's chronological age can be seen as very different to the way in which they present, and that's across all different parts of development. So there's a chart here that explains that quite nicely. So we know that children are very, very good at expressive language, and you think they've understood everything because they can repeat everything back to you, but what we know is that actually the processing of that can be quite difficult for a child, and they may not process things how you wish them to process them, and also they may never be able to retain what it is that you've told them. So even though verbally they're really, really strong, present as much older than they are, that actually isn't the case of their understanding. So this chart here shows a child or a young adult who at the age of 18 has the expressive language of a 20-year-old, the reading ability of a 16-year-old, the living skills of an 11-year-old, money and time concepts of an 8-year-old, and we know that children really, really struggle to understand things like money and getting themselves to places at a certain time, knowing what comes now and what comes next. All those skills are quite delayed. Social skills of a 7-year-old, and the comprehension and maturity to get on with others of a 6-year-old. So you can see there's a huge contrast there if you think about that child presenting verbally as a 20-year-old. However, what they actually understand can be compared to that of a 6-year-old. So when we think about these behaviours and what they might look like in school, quite often, as I said, they will struggle to remember things, so any instruction needs to be very short and simplified. So do this, let them do it. Okay, now you need to do this, and now we need to do. So you're really going to need to break things down. Quite often kids will not remember things that they have done hundreds and hundreds of times every single day. For example, remembering to put their underpants on underneath their trousers. A child I knew got to 15 and still couldn't manage to remember that. And obviously that puts huge stress on families as well. If you imagine doing that every single day for 15 years and still having to remind a child how to get dressed and in what order, that can be pretty exhausting. Quite often these children start to notice that their brain works differently to their peers, and I've noticed that tends to be in around year 3, and that's just my observation with working with these children. There's nothing written down anywhere, but they find actually getting into school particularly stressful, and that can be quite difficult for parents trying to encourage them to go into school, especially if schools don't have that understanding. I'm not sure if it's because Key Stage 2 alters from Key Stage 1, and it's not as nurturing, it's more focused on the sitting rather than the doing, but I'm not sure, but that's my gut instinct. They also realise that their peers don't interact with them in the same way that others do. Quite often our children are immature, and there's a diagram a bit further on that'll help explain that. As I said, they develop strategies to mask the things that they're struggling with. They can manage things once or twice, and then the next thing comes along and it's almost like they've never done that before. Quite often they forget the simple things, and that can become very frustrating, and then they become confused, and then they become anxious or angry or upset. Academically they can be delayed. Alternatively, they can be great at some things, but severely delayed in other areas, which can be really frustrating for everyone, no more so than the child. Often they can be really loving, but also quite often things go unnoticed, and it's not until they reach school age where the differences are noticed. This can also be a real shock for parents who perhaps thought the child was fine and meeting all their developmental milestones, and then suddenly it dawns on them that actually there may be difficulties going forward. So with those things in mind, I've just put together a few clips that you might find really useful to watch on YouTube. Give yourself a limit, because I find it really easy to get drawn into all these different things that people have got to say, because it's quite fascinating and interesting, and you learn so much about listening to other people. But the first one there is helping people with FASD to process what we're saying, and things that they talk about there are things that you may not have realised. By when we say allow a child time to process what you've asked them, actually how long that processing time is. So it's not just a couple of seconds, it could be up to 30 seconds, which when you just stood there could feel like a long time. And the bottom clip there is a birth mother's view who was addicted to crack cocaine and alcohol, and consequently her children have really struggled with different things as they've got older. But as I say, if you sort of stay around that area of YouTube, a lot comes up, so just be mindful that you could lose hours once you've clicked onto those. And I won't talk you through this because this is something that you can read for yourselves, but it's all different impacts of the effect of a child's executive functioning and what that might be, and what that child might need to be able to manage that deficit much more easily with your support. So other things can be helpful, and I've just jotted these down here. Perhaps using mnemonics, sort of things that visual cues or reminders or prompts on the desks might be helpful. Always breaking things down into much smaller pieces of information. Start off with the very basics. Don't progress until that child's retained that very basic information, so they've got a building block to start off with. Try and present things differently, perhaps to music or using rhythm. Also think about cues that might help the student remember the information, so do it the same way. So we do this first and then we do that and then point to the next thing. Repetition, doing things over and over again when something's new, it is one of the basics really. It's got to be done for anything to be able to remain with that child, for them to have grasped and mastered whatever concept that is. And again, just remember that just because they look like they've got it, or they've got a skill that makes you think that they've got it, doesn't mean to say that they have. So with that in mind then, keep going over the same stuff, but also things that they've grasped, so that it doesn't sort of drop off as they learn more stuff. And when working with your students, it's always important to remember that they need time to process information. 30 seconds is what people say. 30 seconds is a long time to stand around waiting for an answer, because socially we're not cued to do that. However, that's what these children need. So even if you just count to 10 in your head really, really slowly, that will be giving the child more information, more time to process what it is that you're asking of them. So don't try and jump in with the answer, just process that. Perhaps even give them a heads up, like, we're going to have a chat about this a bit later on, so just have a look at it and I'll come back to you. So actually that child's got things in mind that you might be going to talk about. There's a table here that speaks about different languages, which is really helpful for people that don't get it. So it's about, and I hope you can see this, about one behaviour being interpreted in one way, but that may be completely different for a child with FASD. So for example, a child might be seen as lazy and not trying. Somebody without any understanding might think they're doing it on purpose, or that they're attention seeking, or that clearly their parents haven't done a very good job. However, they could be totally exhausted with trying. The way that their understanding will fluctuate from day to day is a problem. They may have no concept of time about how long that's taken them to do. So all these things need consideration for us. For every interpretation, there's always an alternative interpretation. So I've just put a few books there that you might find helpful for reading. The one on the left, dealing with Feotal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder, says a guide for social workers, but anybody can read it. It's very readable, and it shows great insight into children with FASD. And the one on the far right is a guide by Marie Catrick for parents and schools, and that again gives lots of ideas and lots of insight. The one in the middle might be useful just for having those conversations with parents, but also to give you a greater understanding of what it's actually like to live with these children and what parents are experiencing. So thank you for listening. I hope you found this presentation helpful. If you need to talk about anything that you've heard in more depth, then please get in touch. There's my email address there and my phone number underneath, and if I don't pick up, then please leave a message and I will get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks a lot.